Tēnā koutou, I reira ana ngā mihi kia koutou I ngā maunga whakahiko hara mai ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Kia kōrua e ngā maraikura, ngā kai kōrero o te ahiahi nei, ka nui te mihi aroha ki o kōrua, ki o koutou katoa, e reira ana ngā mihi ki o koutou tupuna, ki o koutou mainga, nau mai hoki mai ki te kōrero nei. It is a real pleasure to have a slight surprise of 2 rather than 3 wahine superstars to join with us today. So we have apologies from distinguished Professor Maggie Walter, who has had a confluence of digital and time zone challenges and regrets that she can't be with us today. And while we will miss her contributions, we will be thoroughly fascinated in a conversation with 2 women who academically have significant standing, but how I know of them is not just through their intellectual leadership, it's through the service that they give to our communities. So Professor Tahu Kukutai, many of you will have read her extensive body of work. Within the Maori community, what she is known as is one of the leading change agents behind our data sovereignty network and change activism. And Donna Cormack, who many of you will know from her work with the Department of Public Health at Otago, how I know her, not only by having the fortune of being related to her, but as her contributions to the Māori Doctors Network that formed after the national lockdown in response to COVID last year, and her activism and advocacy in those early stages of the response were really important to significant outcomes for our communities. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today, to be able to celebrate what I think is an inspiring exemplars of Indigenous women's intellectual leadership, Indigenous women's service to our communities, and Indigenous women's global citizenship as a national and internationally significant agenda is set. Both of our speakers are fusing perhaps the cause of a generation with their personal identities and the legacy that they'll leave to our world. So would like to ask you all in your very digital ways to join me in welcoming 2 speakers who, through this conversation, what we're really hoping can happen is that we can amplify their thinking in the sphere of Indigenous data sovereignty, the issues, the opportunities, the challenges that our communities, as well as the communities within which our communities live, will need to grapple with. So by looking backwards at the issues of that are associated with data, looking at the challenges of today, and importantly, charting an agenda for those that come after us. So we would like to take the opportunity to invite Professor Tahu to open us up with some opening comments for a few moments, followed by my whanaunga Donna to have a kōrero for a few moments. And then we're going to have a conversation that I have the privilege of asking the first few questions, but then with questions coming from the attendees as well. And because you're all digital humanitarians, you'll be completely comfortable with using the Q&A function to please send any questions in that you have for our panelists. And they will be sorted and prioritized by those who promised chocolate. Just kidding. I was just making sure you're paying attention. So with that invitation to welcome our panelists and to send questions via Q&A, would like to hand the time and floor to Professor Tahu Kukutai. Ngā mihi te tuakana. Kia ora koutou. We are on a digital hui, and so the digital tools are being tricky. So at this point, we're going to respond to Professor Tahu's technical difficulties by switching to Donna, who, fingers crossed, will have a device that wants to cooperate, allowing us a few minutes to behind the scenes return to looking like the duck. Okay. Ka huri ki a koe te whanaunga.
He pai tira. Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koutou kua huhi mai e purangi I te rā nei, I rungi ngā whakaaro, I te āhuatanga o te rā nei. Tēnei te mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa. He uri au no kaitahu no kāti mamoi. Ko ngai te rua hiki hiki ko kātiraki amo ngā hapu, ko Donna, ko Mekahau. So kia ora, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and be with you today. And kia koe, Sacha, for your really kind and slightly intimidating words to live up to. Yeah, so I am a teacher and researcher in Māori health. So I think my entry into the data sovereignty space has come through my broader concerns around social justice, issues around racism and discrimination, and I guess a long-standing and intergenerational commitment to sovereignty. And so data sovereignty, I guess, has been one of the more recent articulations of those concerns. But it always has sat really clearly for me within this broader data justice and Indigenous sovereignty context. I wasn't expecting to talk first, so I was going to riff off what brilliant stuff Tahu usually says. So I'm a little unprepared. I guess probably some of the opening remarks I'd want to make as we all know that our society is becoming increasingly datafied. So the way in which our social practices are sort of measured, the interactions and relationships that we have with each other are often transformed into data. And this happens in active ways, but it happens in really passive ways as well. In the health sector, I've been quite concerned, I guess, for a number of years about this sort of rapid move to an increase in data sharing, data linkage, and integration of large data sets and the sort of elusive and I think as of yet mostly undelivered on promise of data-driven decision-making without a real consideration in any meaningful sense of what this might mean for Indigenous peoples, for Māori in particular, and for other groups that are marginalised within our systems of oppression. And I see it within the sort of broader colonial context within which ways of being and doing, Māori ways of being and doing, and in particular Māori knowledge systems are still actively suppressed or willfully ignored. And so whenever we talk about datification, I really always want us to be super attentive to that colonial context, which hasn't gone away and which infuses all of the sort of data relations and structures and systems that are dominant or hegemonic, I guess, in our society. So I guess I want to ground my conversation in thinking around what does it mean to talk about issues like data justice and data harm from a context that's always and already racialized and colonial. And so here I'm really influenced by the work of decolonial scholars like Césaire and Fanon and Ramon Gross-Figuel, who talks about the division of the world on what Ramon Gross-Figuel calls the line of the human. So this division of the world into people whose rights, knowledge systems, ways of being, ways of knowing, ways of doing are afforded respect and recognition and acknowledgement and whose humanity is not usually in question. And through colonialism and sort of attendant systems of racism and capitalism, heteropatriarchy, people who exist in a zone where actually humanity is in question, whose knowledges, spiritualities, ways of understanding things like data, like knowledge, like information are unsettled and not taken for granted and often not recognised. And so I guess I just wanted to set that scene. It's not a very happy scene, but I think it's a scene that we have to be really mindful of. I feel like sometimes our conversations in these spaces, even when we're talking about Māori data sovereignty, don't recognise the qualitative difference for people who live in those, what Fanon talks about as the zone of being, where actually their humanity isn't questioned, and what it means to talk about datification. How does it manifest? How do data-driven harms and data violence, how are they expressed and experienced in the zone of non-being? And importantly, and I think this is what Indigenous data sovereignty is, part of how is resistance expressed in those zones, and what responses to data harms and datification can be heard from those spaces, and importantly, can we be part of hearing and activating? I feel like Tahu's not back, so I'm wondering if you want me to just keep talking a little bit, Sacha, or you've got a question to ask, or...
You were being a typical resilient Indigenous woman by pioneering despite the need for agility, otherwise known as being put on the spot. So in an act of kindness, how about I ask a couple of questions to relieve some of the burdens? So perhaps quoting Mark Twain isn't quite the appropriate thing to do in the context of decolonial scholarship, but I'm always have that phrase, history might not repeat, but it sure does rhyme a lot in my mind. And so I wondered if you wanted to offer any comments about how data connects into that intergenerational legacy of experiences that Indigenous communities have had, just to provide a deeper understanding about perhaps this being a new frontier for a very similar set of behaviours and patterns, both beyond and within our communities.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. You're right. Often the sort of narrative and rhetoric around data, when we talk about it, digital environments, data ecosystems, sort of deploys that language of progress and development in ways that, you're right, make us think of some of the things that are happening as really novel or new, and sometimes inevitable as well. But when you start to look at the sort of underpinning assumptions and logics in this space, you can really clearly see the continuities in terms of ways of thinking about data and data science, and I should have used scare quotes there, and digital technologies, with actually the colonial and racialized logics that have been in place since invasion. So and I think some of those are the idea that different types of knowing and ways of knowing exist on a hierarchy, and that some are closer to this idea of an objective truth than others. So I see data science often being held up as this sort of new insights or ways of looking at or understanding social phenomenon, but it actually still relies on those same knowledge hierarchies that gives sort of primacy to quantitative data, often towards particular methods of analysis that valorize ideas of objectivity or reduction. And in that sense, it's not very different from what we've experienced as part of colonisation, as a way of sort of, I guess, reinforcing or reifying this idea that some knowledges are superior, some ways of knowing, some ways of coming to know are superior, and in our sort of westernized institution, the ones that are thought to be superior, the ones that are from kind of European intellectual and scientific traditions. And so I guess I don't see much in and here I'm probably talking about in the health science space, I don't see much that's a real radical departure from those fundamental underpinning colonial and racialized logics. So the technologies or the capacity to do things might be different, but actually a lot of the assumptions are the same. And the data harms play out in different ways, but at their core, they're still kind of reproduction of the colonial harms, of the denying of people's full humanities, the denying of Māori ways of knowing and being and of coming to know, and the elevation of kind of imported Western ideologies about what counts as knowledge.
Thank you, Donna, for creating a context that ties us to our past, but hopefully a future that is transformed. And before this panel is over, we will ask both panelists about your aspirations for the future that will take us, I have no doubt, in a more hopeful vein than perhaps the slightly confronting beginning, but important start to this panel. And we now cross to Professor Tahu. Fingers crossed, your technology is cooperating more than before.
Ora. Pai ana? Hari tonu ahai o karawi. Ko te mea tuatahi e mihi kawana ki te mana whenua o tautahi, ngai tahu, ki a koe te kaiarahi o te hui mo te ahi nei, ki a koe Sacha, harikau te ngākau, harikoa te ngākau kia kite i a koe, ki taku hoa mahi, Donna, miharo. Ko wai au, ko tanu Kukutai, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Kino Haku me te o Kauri, no reira tēnā rā tātou katoa. I feel exhausted. I've been in and out of the Zoom room about 20 times to try and fix up the glitch, and it's always highly embarrassing when you're joining a digital conference and nobody can hear you. I have had the experience of sounding like a chipmunk, which is only marginally better than not being able to be heard at all. So I'm glad I'm here, and thank you for your very, very, very generous mihi, Sacha. It's always slightly embarrassing when people talk about you in such effusive terms, and you wonder if they're talking about the right person. But I'm really grateful to be here today to whakawhiti kōrero with you and with Donna, who I've worked with for a very long time, and have really enjoyed working with her. And also with Maggie Walter, and it's a real shame that she can't be here today, but she's just been appointed as well a Truth Commissioner, which is such an important, Donna's talking about the historical mummies that get continued on through the present in different ways, and that mahi that Maggie's doing back in Australia is incredibly important. So it's a shame we can't have her today, but we'll do our best to channel her in our kōrero. I didn't have any opening remarks per se, but I feels like I've been talking about Indigenous data sovereignty for mai rā no, and I haven't. It's really only been a few years, but it's been so intense. Because there's so many pōtai that we bring to this conversation, and you'll know the Sacha as an Indigenous scholar, as a wahine, we wear so many different pōtai at any given time as academics, as advocates, as activists, as hapu members, as tribal members, as advises central government, and then advises to iwi government, and we're sort of in multiple places at any given time. And I guess for people looking outside in, it can look a bit confusing, but for me, this mahi isn't confusing because I always keep fairly central what the purpose of it is. And the purpose for me is actually incredibly simple, and that is to put Maori data in Maori hands for Maori benefit. And if that creates other benefit for Aotearoa, excellent. But I'm pretty unambiguous and unapologetic that Maori data sovereignty is for Maori, and Maori data sovereignty is by Maori. But what we do need is Tiriti partners is for the space for the investment in our infrastructure to be able to realise the ambitions, the collective ambitions that we have. And it's not a monolith. It's not a single ambition. It's multiple ambitions. There's an incredible community of very talented. Donna and I are just two people in a very large network of Maori and globally Indigenous scholars, professionals, doers, Taukaea, working in this area and trying to make a difference in our own way. And sometimes all we really need is the investment in the infrastructure and for people to move out of the way and let us do it. And to sometimes be helpful when asked, but to not necessarily try and do it on our behalf or lead. And being in the middle of a global pandemic, I think really sort of makes clear certain inadequacies in the system, and where things can be done much better. And certainly I think we have a number of very tangible and concrete examples of where if we had the systems set up by us, for us as data designers, we would have been able to activate and enable in much more timely ways our local intelligence on the ground. And I have no doubt whatsoever that we can do that better than central government. And having written fairly recently a report on the sort of interface of science and policy, and there were some very sort of clear messages in that there is a lack of sort of cultural competency and safety within the kāwanatanga with government agencies, and they're not that well placed to enact data sovereignty. There's still a need to. There's absolutely a need to have robust, transparent, accountable, generative data governance over our data, which such a huge proportion of it is held by government agencies. And Aotearoa being one of the most digitally sophisticated nations in the world, we need to keep our eyes on that. And it's not about compliance either. It's actually about catapulting institutions to do better. And so we need that robust and transparent and accountable data governance. But really, and I've written about this with Donna, and Donna always says it's so much smarter. Because Donna is a real theorist, and that's why I love working with her as well. That there's limits given to. I was in and out of the Zoom room, so I didn't catch all of your kōrero, Donna, but I know your kōrero, having worked with you for a few years now. And given the limits of data colonialism and extractive relationships, which really configure the sort of data ecosystems, really the potential of data sovereignty or Maori data sovereignty here in Aotearoa. There's real limits in trying to realise that in the architecture of the settler state. But there's real potential in what we can make of it for ourselves. So I don't know, is that opening remarks? I think that's opening remarks. It was a bit of a riff. I just look forward to having a deep and engaging discussion on this really important kaupapa.
Te toa kana konei te mihi ki a koe. Thank you for enduring through the technological difficulties to be with us and to bless us with those comments. Given that you've introduced the pandemic context, and Donna, I know that you've been intimately involved in Māori responses to COVID, I wonder whether it would be helpful to have a conversation about what has happened recently with access to data concerning vaccinations, because we know from being bombarded from it in the media that Māori had really low vaccination rates for a period, that the Final Water Commissioning Agency took the Ministry of Health to court seeking access to data. And so I was wondering if I could ask you a question with two parts about the first, the complexities about Māori vaccination rates. What do you think they reflect about some of the challenges and issues relating to data sovereignty? And the second part, if we'd had a magic wand and Māori data sovereignty had existed before we started vaccinating, what do you think the vaccination rollout could have looked like? To give us an example of how Māori data sovereignty is both well, it's symbolic as a point of principle, but it's also a practical transformation tool. We'll turn to Tahu first.
Well, can I tuki te rākau kia Donna, only because my Donna here is deeply involved in Te Rōpū Uruta, and she is, deep. This is her deep lane, so I think I'll defer to Donna and then I'll follow up, if that's okay, Sacha.
Yeah, so I guess for me, one of the things that has become apparent, or I should say reapparent, is the fact that even though there's been this increasing engagement at some level with between the Crown and its various government agencies and Māori over issues around Māori data sovereignty, and you can see the rhetoric of some of that coming through in different documents and strategies, that as with equity and te tiriti and other sort of discourses, it became pretty apparent as the COVID pandemic happened that language was, and here I'm drawing on Sarah Ahmed's idea of non-performativity. So there were words, but there wasn't a lot of action behind the words, and in some ways the words became seen as the action. So writing it into a policy or talking about it was sort of taken as a commitment or an action to it, but there was nothing really meaningful or deeply embedded behind that practice. And that's what I saw playing out in relation to Māori data during the COVID pandemic, and still playing out, is that even though these conversations have been happening at some level for a number of years, there wasn't anything really that had been established in a meaningful and deep and committed way. And here I'm on behalf of the Crown, to actually make sure that Māori data sovereignty, or even sort of an awareness of data justice and data harm more broadly, was embedded in its kind of everyday practices. So then when the pandemic or a crisis hits, there's nothing there except for rhetoric, and that rhetoric is pretty empty, as we see playing out now. And so there were no Māori data governance, clear Māori data governance structures or arrangements or decision-making power embedded in the Ministry of Health, for example, that meant when digital tools were being conceptualised and RFPs were going out and registers were getting set up, that there was any sort of avenue for Māori decision-making. Even though the Crown and the Ministry of Health were alerted right at the start of the pandemic about how this was going to play out if that didn't happen. Yeah, so where was I going with that? I guess I was, I guess it's kind of put into sharp focus that there hasn't been any sort of radical shift in my experience, and particularly in the health sector, in terms of actually embedding a commitment to Māori data sovereignty that's more than just really some high-level discussions or conversations about it. And so that's where you get decisions being made, like the decision about the denominator, like the decision not to collect ethnicity data when a vaccination is happening that mean that we have data, that systems and processes that don't work for Māori, and don't allow us to monitor what's happening for Māori communities. And importantly, for self-determination, don't allow us to have the information that we need to act in self-determined ways to respond to the priorities and needs and aspirations of our community. And it's playing out now, I think, through the Vaccine Pass and the Pass Verify app. I still see this complete absence of meaningful engagement in any consistent way with Māori data sovereignty and Māori data governance. And then the data harms, and not just the data harms, the literal life and death harms fall to Māori and other marginalised communities. Yeah, I'm not the one to take you to a hopeful space, sorry, so I'll hand the rākau back to Tahu.
You say I'm a hopeful person, Donna. I am actually. I think there's a article on the internet that has me speaking about optimism. They must have caught me on a very good day, but I do have a smidgen of optimism. But I mean, I guess on this topic, I guess what was really interesting about the court case with Whānau Ora and the Ministry of Health is that it sort of became a contest between individual privacy and collective rights and interests and collective benefit. And in a way, this is sort of the crux. One of the challenges for Māori data sovereignty and the context of where sort of data privacy and data protection and data rights are very much sort of in regulatory frameworks for privacy, like the European Union, GDPR, are all much very configured on the rights, the data rights of individuals, premise on concepts of personal data. Which means that privacy concerns are often conflated with the potential for an individual to be identified from their data, and it really sort of limits the scope of understanding privacy rights or establishing protections. And one of the interesting things that came out of the court ruling was that if the Ministry of Health is going to espouse, and Donna was talking about Sarah Med and that sort of non-performativity, if the Kāwanatanga is going to espouse Te Tiriti as being meaningful for how they see their partnership and how they operate, then they have to give force to that, give effect to that, and can't just rely on sort of individual privacy rights. So it's a very interesting case for a range of reasons. But on the ground, our whānau could die. I mean, this is the reality, and it's so predictable. Our Māori health experts were warning about this so long ago and saying, look, here's the plan. We know that inequities are deeply embedded in our health system. They're deeply embedded in all systems, but you see this particular way in health. When you're in the middle of a global pandemic, you need to confront that reality and design it with equity at the centre. And if you don't, you're going to get a highly, even then you might just get closer to equity. If you go full frontal early on. And the thing was that our Māori health experts said that, and they came up with a plan. And data was at the heart of that as well. But data is not just about data. Data is actually about collective benefit. It's about nation building. It's about protecting our people, our whānau, and our communities. Otherwise, sort of, what's the point? And so there were so many. It's just really just a concrete example of data colonialism, isn't it? And sort of whose knowledge is privileged, whose expertise really counts, and who knows us better than we know ourselves. This is just an old adage of colonialism, isn't it? Really, the Indigenous subject, but the problem is the consequences are so dire for our whānau, and we can already see that Māori are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and to try and put in place sort of ad hoc measures belatedly really puts us on the back foot. But it's complex. I said earlier that for me it's simple. It's about putting Māori data in Māori hands. but I don't think that should be construed as putting all Māori data in any Māori hands. And it's nuanced. And, you know, if we want to do things better, if we think we can do things better than the kāwanatanga, and we want to drive towards a tikanga-informed practice that puts our collective well-being at the centre, then we need to really have our own tikanga informing the way in which we relate to each other, the ethics around our data use, and that involves sometimes in conversations amongst ourselves. You know, Te Ao Māori is incredibly diverse. We are not all the same, but we need that space to have those conversations with ourselves so we can figure out how we can work together to get the best outcomes for our whānau. And it makes it really hard to have those conversations with ourselves in a timely fashion when we're reacting to you know, top-down decision making that may be missing the mark. So there's a lot of, you know, wrong turns, but when those wrong turns end up with people dying, you know, it's a terrible time, really. And for me, it's about thinking about how can data be a practical use to practically help our whānau in these very uncertain times.
Could I add a couple of things? Yeah. And so one of the other contextual issues here too is that the quality of that data is not great. And so this is another concern for me, that even if we had access to the data that the ministry has about us, they haven't shown any, they don't have a track record of actually addressing the well-known, well-documented issues with the quality of that data for Māori. So I've kind of assumed this sort of paternalistic stewardship role over holding our health data about us and for us, and yet then they have failed to have data that actually captures Māori as a population, let alone captures health information or indicators that are actually of importance or relevance for us. So even if we had access to the data they have about us, I don't know that it helps us always, because it's often such poor quality and is answering or speaking to indicators or targets or measures that actually not the ones that are important to us. And I think the other issue, I think, sorry, it's hard to carry on when a Pepe enters the room. I think there's also another thing that we saw happening with COVID and in the institution of systems like contact tracing and other sort of policies and practices was again this reverting to centralisation and standardisation and universalisation as the way, the best way to sort of get through things. And I think that's another space where Indigenous data sovereignty and Māori data sovereignty offers a completely different way of understanding data and information in the world, and by its real attention to local context, its ability to sit comfortably with diverse realities, multiple ways of knowing, and I guess seeing real value and strength in localization rather than pulling everything up into a centralized way of kind of organizing data. So, you know, the data that would be really useful for us is really community level data that's under community control, that communities have access to, governance over, and tikanga to keep safe. And then if the Crown wants it, they can come and ask for it, and they might get it or they might not, with certain strings attached. But this idea that we're going to be well served when there's no history or track record of us being well served by the Crown having stewardship or control over that data for us, I think we really need to think about the ways in which technology and the digital environment actually offers opportunities and potentials for a decentralization, for a much more distributed model or a federated model of organising, storing, collecting data that actually serves our communities better and is closer to us, and therefore makes it easier for us to exercise our rangatiratanga, our control and kaitiakitanga over that data.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Donna. And, the technology's there. It's not like we're waiting for a technology that's 10 years down the road. I mean, the technology's been there for a long time. And I say this as someone who's actually not a technologist. Like I do mahi with data, but I'm not a technologist like some of our data sovereignty, Maori data sovereignty colleagues. But the technology there that enables it, much more sort of federated systems, distributed systems, taking the data closer to communities, as Donna's said in a really articulate way, that exists. It's not a problem with the technology, it's a problem with relinquishing control. Surprise, and just sort of, shifting that locus of control away from the sites that are so used to it, that it's become so much a part of business as usual that it almost becomes invisible. It becomes sort of part of process, but actually it's these deeply embedded power structures that make it really hard to give up control. And so in order for any of this to work, that sort of has to happen at a certain level. But there are ways around it. There's a project that I've been working on for 4 or 5 years now with my hapu, Ngāti Tipa, where we've basically been spending years repatriating our data and the sort of fragments of us that lie in archives and libraries and repositories and digitizing it. We don't ask permission. This is from our tupuna. This is from our whenua. These institutions exist to serve Aotearoa and us. So it's been a sort of a massive exercise in data repatriation, but we're not taking it out of institutions, we're digitizing, it still remains there, but it remains there without context. And largely the multi sort of layered meanings, they don't exist and they maybe don't belong in those state-controlled institutions, although, some of them do some amazing mahi. I'm not saying they don't, some of them really do. And the kaimahi Maori in there, I really take my kōtai off to them in terms of the advocacy and the important role that they do for our communities, connecting us to our taonga. But that wasn't really enough for this project, and so we did this years of sort of digital repatriation, and then begins the process of figuring out how it all fits together. What is our tikanga and kaua? It's one thing to repatriate, but when you put it together, it takes on a whole set of meanings. It becomes something else, and you need the tikanga and the kaua around it to keep it safe, to keep you on track, to keep you accountable, to make sure that you're reflecting the aspirations of the whānau, whose tupuna much of this data came from. So we've been really kind of figuring our way through as we've gone, and it's been a really remarkable journey, a collective one. And even though it was funded by research funding, none of this sort of taonga data in the digital repository that we've built for ourselves to be controlled by ourselves, according to our own tikanga and kaua, it doesn't belong to the university. It doesn't belong to the funder. They've provided putia to enable something wonderful to happen. It's been tricky and challenging and lots of ups and downs and twists and turns, but it belongs to the people. And to me, we have to, I think real transformation only really lies with ourselves. And in this digital landscape, we find our own ways of how to affect that in different ways. But there still was, in my view, the government does have a tiriti obligation to meaningfully invest in Maori, iwi, hapu controlled data infrastructure, because they've invested plenty in themselves. We have one of the most highly sophisticated integrated data infrastructures in the world. The government can see with quite detailed precision into the lives of our whānau. And so they has the power to do that. But for our own mana motuhake, we need the capacity and capability to be able to do that for ourselves as well. And we can't always self-fund it on a smell of an oily rag.
Which leads into the last question I'd like to ask before we turn to questions that come from those who are participating in the conference. And that is about how data sovereignty can serve the developmental evaluations of Māori and Indigenous communities. Because already in this conversation, we've traversed from that beautiful example of data sovereignty is about having our own stories about ourselves, through to data sovereignty is literally about life and death in our communities. So when you think about the role of data sovereignty in serving Māori and Indigenous communities today, what do you think the role of data sovereignty is in Indigenous development more broadly? Aroha mai with that. The last time I offered a suggestion about who went first, we traded anyway. So we'll stick with asking for a volunteer to go first on that question.
And I think here, yeah, and it's a real shame, I think, that Maggie is not here, because I'm really influenced by her writing around data and Indigenous data, and the fact that so she talks about this sort of paradox, and sorry to speak kind of for her, but I really want her ideas to be in this space with us, even if she can't be with us today. This paradox that we find ourselves in, where there's, on the one hand, so much data about us, and Tahu, you alluded to that, all this data that sort of the Crown has amassed about us, often without our knowledge or under very coercive or non-consensual circumstances, and the data that we actually need, which is often the data that speaks to the futures that we want for our mokopuna, and the aspirations that we have for our communities, and that's the data that often just is completely absent. So I think it's really, I think data has a place. I think data has a place, but we need to be open to sort of unsettling the idea of what we see as data, and what types of data we elevate above other types. And I think Indigenous data sovereignty offers us the opportunity to do that as well, to have a broader, more contextualized, more relational understanding of what data is. Yeah, so I think coming back to sort of Tahu's point, we have this sort of well-resourced infrastructure that has a lot of investment in it, but I think it has very limited ability to answer questions that are of deep interest to Māori whānau and communities, because the indicators and variables that are in those data sets are not the ones that speak to either our lived experiences and realities, or our past, or the futures that we imagine or envision or dream. And so there's this tension that we find, and that I'm sure most people working in this sort of sector find, where we're aware of the potential for data harms to occur, and so we're often reacting and responding to try to prevent or preempt, or at least buffer the impact of those harms. And a lot of energy has gone into that in the COVID pandemic, and that takes us away from the ability to sit with each other, to wānanga with each other, to dream with each other, and then to think about, well, what's the data that we need? What's the data systems, data storage, data processes, data relations that will enable us to get closer to where we want to go, which is back, return to sovereignty. So I'm not sure if that was an answer or just like a little rant, but I guess I see huge potential, but I agree with Tahu that huge potential comes from an active disinvestment in both sort of intellectual and material ways in the Crown's data agenda. So we need to have time and space to sit with each other and figure out what we need and where we want to go. And the Crown needs to disinvest as well in its harmful data practices and its kind of obsession with sort of the stewardship model of knowing about us and thinking it can know us better than we can know ourselves, and actively invest in Māori communities. So, I mean, I think I'm interested in this space about, I think it's hard to get very far if one party's not willing to give anything up. And I'm always interested in what the Crown is willing to give up in this space. If there is a commitment to Indigenous data sovereignty, what are you going to disinvest in? What are you going to give up? What are you going to give back? I think that's the conversations we need to have.
Yeah, tautoko, Donna. And I think just to loop round back to your pātai, Sacha, around how does data sovereignty, how does Māori data sovereignty, which is different from the sort of mainstream concept of data sovereignty, which is really one that's largely around jurisdictional control. And Indigenous data sovereignty is around Indigenous collectives' right to control their own data that comes from them, whether it's individuals, collectives, their whenua, their culture. So it's a very different concept of data from mainstream data sovereignty that's been dominant in the literature for some time. So I mean that question around how does Indigenous data sovereignty connect to Indigenous sort of development, or as our colleagues in the US would talk about as their really nation rebuilding and nation building, and they kind of see it as this sort of dual relationship. One is around the governance of data, and this is typically sort of data that's held by the nation state. Or I think I think sometimes we fixate too much on the nation, on the government, and a lot of the sort of data risks, data harms, data benefits, and data value actually being generated in the private sector, multinational corporations, not the government agencies, but through our treaty relationship, our tiriti relationship, it's a comfortable foe, the kāwanatanga. But we ought not, ever take our eyes off what's going on in other spaces. But the other flip side of that, and the one which probably we talk about more, is around data for governance. So what is the kind of data that we actually need for our own? Governance is really a term there, which is a very broad term to encompass development, nation building, community building, whānau building, whānau ora. What's the sort of data that we need? What are the sort of systems that we need to really realise our own ambitions? And it's sort of an and, not an either or. But the thing is, if you can get too fixated with trying to sort out the governance of data that's been held by someone else, some other organisation, institution, entity, you don't have much time for focusing on your own transformational opportunities and potential in your own spaces, and it's very easy to get distracted. I mean, Donna and I probably get emails on a weekly, daily, sometimes daily basis on we know we need to do data sovereignty, Māori data sovereignty, tell us how to do it. Like we have a sort of a 101 plan that we can just sort of disseminate, and it doesn't work like that. Others actually have to do the work. But the thing is, if you get so caught up in reacting to others' agendas, you completely lose sight of the transformative potential in your own space. And for me, this is where the real potential is actually. And there's many others who are already doing mahi in this space. I mean, the tribal leaders, the iwi chairs, National Iwi Chairs Forum have a data iwi leadership group who I also work with. They are incredibly active. They're doing all sorts of amazing projects which are very firmly focused on collective wellbeing and trying to do it as a collective. And that doesn't stop other iwi and hapu from doing their own projects, but it's really to try and realise at scale some of the key bits of the architecture that are going to help all hapu and iwi. So there's some incredible mahi going on in that space by people who are very passionate, very committed, very clever, and they're making great strides really. And part of the trick is like as Donna said, is really sort of getting the Crown to disinvest in their own in themselves and start shifting that investment over to Te Ao Māori and trusting us that we will actually do a good job with it. And not only will we do a good job, we might even do a better job. And there's plenty of examples of doing a better job, I think. So there was a second part to that question, but I think my little crammed brain has forgotten the second part of that. But I think that the point I just wanted to make is that relationship between sort of data and development and those sort of aspirations. Just to link back to the example that I've been working on for a while with Ngāti Tipa is, we've decided that whakapapa is our key enabler for our collective well-being. And so there's so many different kinds of data in different places that it's a bit overwhelming. So we've just focused on what's the data that's most important for us at the moment. And that's our whakapapa data. And being good kaitiaki of that, making sure that our tikanga and kawa around our taonga data is appropriate and sustainable, and that this will deliver benefits for not just our mokopuna of today, but our future mokopuna. So being quite purposeful in what kind of data that we're investing our time in as our whakapapa data, and with that our whenua data, and building our repository, our digital archive, to hold that and steward that in the best way possible for future generations. Now we've got one of the other research projects that I'm involved in, tikanga and technology. We've got a kāhui kaumātua who keeps us in check, and it's amazing all the sorts of kaupapa that they come up with that they're interested in. They're concerned about racially biased algorithms. They're concerned about intellectual property rights and waiata and karakia mātauranga that's shared on Facebook. They're concerned about whakapapa that's shared on sites like ancestry.com and and MyHeritage, and how do where's the tikanga that keeps that safe? So there's so many issues, there's so many kaupapa that we need the space and the time to be across. But I think if we're clear about our own sort of tikanga and the way that we're going to do that, then that puts us sets some good foundation.
Ngā mihi, there's a perennial Indigenous issue in there about how much we serve inside our own communities and how much we act as a bridge for others outside our communities to understand our issues. One that's on the bridge side of the question from one of our participants is a great question about whether you would, both or either of you would like to comment on the implications of Amazon's AWS arriving in Aotearoa and what that might mean for Indigenous data sovereignty.
Unsurprisingly, I have some thoughts. I think it's been really interesting in my engagement with different government agencies and institutions when we talk around Māori data sovereignty, even if we're clear about our sort of understanding being much broader than jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is often the issue that people seem to get hung up on, and so we end up having conversations about what happens when you offshore data or you transfer sort of storage or control of data outside of New Zealand jurisdiction. But jurisdiction is a bit more complicated than that, and particularly as I understand it, in relation to US companies, US law actually applies on the basis of the company that stores the data rather than where it's physically located. So I think this idea that having overseas companies store data locally in New Zealand sort of solves any jurisdictional issues or data sovereignty issues is a little naive. Aside from that, one of the things that I think Māori data sovereignty does for me, because it's such a values-based, principles-based way of thinking about data, try to think about data in relational ways, and also thinking about our responsibility as kaitiaki of the environment and as tangata whenua, I think it gives us insights into if we are making decisions, for example, about where we store our data, they need to be also decisions that actually are good for Papatūānuku, not bad for Papatūānuku, that are good ethically for Indigenous people, not bad ethically for Indigenous people. So aside from the jurisdictional issue, I have major concerns about the government's, I guess, continued sort of investments in companies that have caused massive harm to Indigenous peoples internationally, have appalling human rights track records, and have a massive impact on our environment in terms of the running of large data warehouses. So I think, Indigenous data sovereignty principles and ways of thinking about data that are much more contextualized and relational allows us to interrogate some of those issues as well, so that we can hopefully not only be driven by questions around sort of efficiencies or cost, and actually think about what does it mean to invest in companies that are actually harmful for Indigenous people, and even more broadly than that, how data colonialism is playing out through this really familiar colonial kind of fixation on accumulation, just collecting more and more data and storing more and more data, and that has a real environmental impact. So yeah, that's some of my thoughts on that question.
I guess I'll just add on to that. So that was a question that I can see in the chat window from Sydney, Kia ora Sydney, about Amazon AWS. And yeah, I mean, I'm on board with Donna here, but I guess the thing is, if we just start from sort of Māori data sovereignty principles, which you can find on the Te Manararanga website, and probably a lot of people are familiar with them now, but it does say there that, wherever possible, Māori data should be stored in Aotearoa. And the government has a cloud first policy. They do have procurement arrangements, and a growing amount of Māori data is now stored offshore. And I guess some of the logics that sort of underpin that is that sort of multinational companies who provide those services are more mature, and so that have a greater level of sort of data security. But of course, they're also cheaper than sort of building local storage solutions, I suppose. And so in between the sort of foreign-owned offshore data and the Māori-owned locally hosted solutions, the sort of multinational locally hosted solutions like Amazon. And I guess the questions here, Donna's just talking about sort of the ethics of multinational corporations, the extent to which they really benefit Indigenous peoples as collectives, although as individuals, people might, get benefit from the services that they offer, but we're talking about collectives, is that, what are the levers, what are the mechanisms that will ensure that those multinational corporates act in a way that's consistent with Māori data sovereignty, if indeed we take Māori data sovereignty as our starting point. And then also some of the other arguments around West is best are largely untested. Why can't we, as one of the world's most digitally advanced nations, why can't we take a long-term sustainable approach that invests in our own local storage? What is the cost, and what is the costs and benefits. I think that leads to unhelpful kōrero around trade-offs. And I think I'm more interested in balancing that risk, but also in investing in Maori controlled local storage solutions that are tikanga informed. And if that investment in that option, in that Indigenous controlled, locally stored option is different, if the ethics governing that is different, maybe that's going to be better for others as well, not just Maori communities. So at some stage we have to sort of grow up and get a bit of maturity, take a punt on ourselves, not assume that overseas is always going to be best. Yes, they have scale, yes, they have experience, but we can do some great stuff ourselves. We want to be sort of data innovators, but also want to keep that contained. I think one of the things about us as Māori, we're not very good at being contained. We think sort of wildly and expansively, and I think that's exciting, and differently. And I think that's actually what's needed in this data space. Otherwise, we will just see a replaying of the familiar things in a different context, but same game, different name. And that's not what we want. That's fundamentally pushing against that is what Indigenous data sovereignty is about. Is about trying to reimagine something different on our own terms. And other people might not necessarily get it at first, but that's okay. But it's about having the opportunity to do that. But more than that, it's also about having a regulatory environment that's friendly to that. It's about having the levers and the mechanisms that enable us to enact that. And a key part of that is missing here in Aotearoa at the moment. But I believe that they can absolutely be designed and implemented, but they can't be done on our behalf. They have to be done by us, for us.
In that spirit of it has to be done by us, for us, I'm aware that the digital humanities community is likely to have a high degree of resonance with lots of the principles and aspirations behind Indigenous data sovereignty. And I wonder whether you've both got comments on what the potential contributions are that digital humanitarians can make to the furtherance and aspirations of Indigenous data sovereignty.
Do you want me to go first, Tahu?
Yeah, I'm still catching my breath, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for me that taking on Tahu's comments really early on that, if Indigenous data sovereignty, Māori data sovereignty as part of a sovereignty movement it's a by Indigenous for Indigenous, Indigenous-led movement, but there is a place for the complementary work. There's not only a place, there's necessary work that needs to be done in support of that aspiration. And that's really, I guess, having these sorts of conversations, having a commitment to a critical digital humanities that will engage with the context within which we're theorising and thinking and operating, that will reckon with some of the problematic aspects of the discipline, and I come from a humanities and social sciences background, and recognise and be open to thinking about our disciplines and where they have potentially caused harm and what sort of things need to change in the future, what restorative practices need to be put in place to make sure that the harm impacts don't carry forward. So I think a commitment, I guess, in digital humanities to anti-colonial digital practices and relations provides like a really nice complementary and necessary, just lost all my words, sorry, necessary action and movement that I think is beneficial for society in general, but also supports and doesn't get in the way of an Indigenous data sovereignty movement. Does that make sense? So I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, there's a lot of work that digital humanities as a discipline can do to engage with the broader issues around data colonialism, around data harm, around data justice, around what an anti-colonial or decolonial digital humanities would look like. That supports the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, but also I think is where probably digital humanities hopefully wants to go and needs to go anyway. I think one of the areas where I see potential, and maybe this is because it resonates with me as someone who's not that into binaries, is the kind of openness in the digital humanities space to moving across sort of traditional boundaries and disciplines or topic areas or methods. And so I think that bodes well for these sorts of conversations because it indicates already some level of willingness to this idea that actually there's multiple ways of thinking about things and doing things. There's a multiverse out there rather than a universe. And so that's, I guess that's an area where I see potential for moving away from this kind of deeply embedded sort of hierarchy of knowledge into a much more open, expansive way of thinking about data and digital spaces.
Kia ora. So look, I'm no expert on the digital humanities, and I know it's a really broad church, and so I'm not really going to even pretend to be an expert on the digital humanities. I think usually what I do is just sort of talk about the thing that I do know about, and then hopefully the people who are cooking or experts in their own field see something that resonates, and then think about how it can be useful for their thinking and doing in the spaces they work in. I do think that probably a lot of the people working, not exclusively of course, but a fair number of people who work in the digital humanities are scholars who work within institutions like universities. And universities have a lot of Indigenous data, and I was just giving a talk with Stephanie Vainey-Cower, who's just a fantastic scholar, one of the founders of the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and her and Desi Rodriguez Lonebeer sort of co-founded the US IDSOV network, and then we had the Maori one here where a group of our colleagues and ourselves helped to establish. Maggie, of course, established one in Australia. And then we had our pioneering Indigenous data sovereignty warrior aunties who set up the First Nations Information Governance Centre more than 2 decades ago. And this amazing trailblazing work in Indigenous data sovereignty before it was even a word or even a concept, but that's what they were doing for their own communities, their First Nations communities. So there's all these sort of networks and growing number of community-specific data sovereignty network as well. And who are doing sort of fantastic work in their own areas, and we get together and try and figure out how we can do things collectively at a global scale and what we can learn from each other in our own context. And so I was giving a talk with Stephanie a couple of weeks ago for the National Science Foundation. I think it was around sort of like a 101 on data sovereignty, because Indigenous data sovereignty issues, there's some massive issues by big funders of research, and really just trying to disrupt the way in which research is currently being done so that it takes Indigenous people's concerns seriously over data sovereignty, and not just takes the concerns seriously, but actually starts to activate the behaviour change, and catapult institutions to work differently. And Stephanie and her colleagues in the US have been doing some really fantastic work around this, not specifically on the digital humanities, but I think it would resonate with people who are in the digital humanities about how to do things differently, and how Indigenous data sovereignty might be relevant to the work that you do. And in terms of universities, which are massive repositories of Indigenous data, often not controlled by Indigenous peoples at all. Often Indigenous communities don't even know their data's there, where it's been stored, where it's been held, who has control over it. And ostensibly, Indigenous communities have control over it, but they don't even know where it is. how can you really exercise meaningful control over it? So, there's all this data that's sitting in institutions, and it really is, the time is really right for universities as knowledge institutions to sort of do away with the maze mentality that makes it really impossible for Indigenous peoples to find their own data in these institutions, and to open the door and provide the mechanisms for communities to reconnect with their data. So there's a lot of opportunity for sort of Indigenous-led, Indigenous by design and future focus data sovereignty approaches within these institutions. And I would think that digital humanities would be sort of an obvious place where you could start to think about what this looks like. We already have data sovereignty principles with domestic networks. If you go to any of the data sovereignty websites, you'll see that they all have their own set of principles, which shares a high degree of overlap, but also has some contextual differences. And there's also the global ones, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA. There's a website with the care principles on there. I think that universities in particular need to commit to Indigenous data infrastructure as a long-term investment, both hard and soft forms of infrastructure. Again, make it easy for communities to access their data and ditch that maze mentality, enable distributed systems that Donna was talking about some time ago. There's lots of opportunities to co-produce policy and practice to embed rights, interests, and ethics, and to act with accountability and control and transparency. And with the massive amounts of data that digital scholars in the digital humanities are accumulating, I would think that these sort of signposts would be really relevant to the work that they do if they're kind of thinking future focus. How can we do differently? How can we support and be allies?
Which leads beautifully on to the final question, which is for both of you. What is your one big priority for Indigenous data sovereignty over the next few years? If you had a magic wand, what would you liberate or do with it?
I guess I'll start. And I think, speaking to Tahu's point about not being good at being constrained, I'm not very good at answering questions that are like, what's the one thing you would do? But I'll try. So I think for me, what Māori data sovereignty offers as a way for me to think through and around issues to do with data that has the potential to go somewhere that's radically different from where we are now. So I think Māori data sovereignty helps to remind me to think about relationships with data in a different way. So moving away from that sort of reductionist, sort of positivist, quantitative understanding of data to one that reimagines data and practices and data relationships as a returning to our own ways of knowing and being, and that center relationships and kinship, and is open to the idea of a pluriverse or a multiple way of knowing. And so I think for me, I can't even remember what the question is now, but I think for me that's as close as I get to the hopeful bit, but that's I guess Māori data sovereignty gives me a framework and a little bit of a structure and some language to really talk through what a radically different and better data future could look like, and some ways to think through how I can get closer to that for me, but also for my whānau and mokopuna and generations to come. I think that's probably, I think it's a space to dream because it challenges the status quo and the kind of dominance of particular ways of thinking about data. And so that here I'm thinking about thinking that I've been doing with Hannah Burgess and influenced by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's writing around refusal, that saying no is also opening space for a yes. So Indigenous data sovereignty and Māori data sovereignty, when we start to think about the things that are we want to say no to in the data space, it opens up a whole lot more places and spaces to dream about what the yes is, what it can look like. Yeah, I think that's the exciting and expansive part of Māori data sovereignty for me, is that collective dreaming and knowing that we've had something different and we can have something radically different from what we've got now. And that's what our mokopuna deserve.
Thank you.
Tautoko is what it is, what our mokopuna deserved. And I was thinking of Wakatū Corporation, who you'd be familiar with, and Te Tauhi Sacha, and they've got their Te Pai Tawhiti, I think, is their intergenerational plan. It's a 500-year plan. And, and God knows what crazy technology we're going to have in, 50 years' time, let alone 500 years' time. But I just really love that strong, future-looking, our mokopuna's mokopuna. That's what we want. That's what well-being looks like. It's not just about your children. It's about your ongoing collective identity and ethos and values. And we do, Donna's 100% right, we do need a dramatically different way of thinking about vast quantities of data. I think being in the middle of the pandemic, and, we can see so clearly the limits of the individual, of everything being built around individual benefit, individual rights, individual interests, and that carries over into data as well. So just, a radically different way of thinking about, data protection, data benefits, that goes beyond the individual, which is so much at the heart of all the thinking at the moment, which pushes back against the open data mantra. One of our kaumata, or for those who aren't from Aotearoa, and elders, one of our elders, who guides one of our ethical tikanga and technology, or sort of ethical technology and data research projects, said, bring back the tapu. Not everything needs to be known. Bring back the wairua. Where's the spiritual in the data? And these concepts might sound really odd to people who are more used to thinking about data in a very sort of mechanistic, technological sense. But we need tikanga. We need rules around what can be, what should be available and what shouldn't. And when it comes to Indigenous data, it should be Indigenous people setting the rules, not governments and not multinational corporations. And that sort of data capitalism and that extractive sense of value, what's the value that can be harnessed, unlocked, unleashed from the data, turning those concepts away from that sort of narrow extractivist logics around value to benefit. And how can we move towards a way of thinking, a way of doing that's much more focused on relationships and benefit. And so there's so much to do, and I think there's so much to offer from the distinctive ways that we think can act as Indigenous peoples and communities. It's so different. And there's obviously shared commonalities and overlaps, but there's aspects of Te Ao Māori which are very different from Te Ao Whānui here in Aotearoa. We know that because we reside in that, we live with it on a daily basis. And when I think about some of the tauira or the students in the Pūhoro STEM Academy, which is academy which is set up to really accelerate Indigenous Māori STEM capability, but it's got an extra M, it's STEM So it's not just science, technology, engineering and maths, but it's also mātauranga Māori, that's the other M. That's our own Indigenous knowledge systems and ways of knowing. And it's at that interface, of, you know, technology and Indigenous thinking, mental models and ways of being that I think the creative potential can really be realised in a way that's dramatically different from what we see around us at the moment. I've run out of words.
Tēnā kōrua, thank you so much for holding down a really complex and deep conversation. We have missed our mate, the distinguished professor, but we've only missed her presence because we knew it was coming. Both of you have more than filled this space and more than filled this time. So I want to thank you for giving your time to this kaupapa. Time is the one thing that we can't get back. Maybe data as well, that might be the second thing we can't get back, but definitely time. And you've got so many calls on your time. So I want to thank you. And in true digital form, there is a koha coming to both of you, which appropriately reflects a form of Indigenous sovereignty. It's a taonga from Ngāi Tahu Pounamu that many of you will know that Pounamu is one of our taonga within Aotearoa, that because of no one paying attention to the details of obscure English law, passed an ownership to the Crown by default. And then as part of our settlement, one of our ways of testing the good faith of the Crown during our extended negotiations was for the Crown to vest Pounamu back in the ownership of Ngāi Tahu. So I think that there are really strong parallels with the Pounamu that will come to you with aroha and respect for your time, hopefully marking the potential for data to also be revested in us, whether that is data that is our own ways of knowing, or whether that is data that is about fueling our own ways of doing. Thank you so much for sharing the many complexities and tensions in this space. For me, who's a practitioner at heart, the COVID story, I think, is one that marks in sharp relief the importance of this issue. Going from, in our first national lockdown, Māori for the first time in our contemporary history having better social outcomes than non-Māori. So we bucked intergenerational trends of inequity by doing better than, to now marking however many countless days of Māori being the majority of those who are infected with COVID. In the middle of that story, which started as a beacon of hope and now is something that I think makes our hearts tremble when we see the daily counts. Data is fundamentally the linchpin in that. When we had the space to use our own data to do our own response network, we looked after our communities. Whereas with this phase of COVID, when we were locked out of the data, when decisions were made on the basis of data without our insights, like who was prioritised for vaccination, we get what we know and don't want to be true, which is the perpetuation of intergenerational inequity. So thank you to the both of you for marking the card of the significance of Indigenous data sovereignty. And Donna, despite your comments, otherwise, you've both provided us with hope and optimism about the potential of Indigenous data sovereignty and the contributions that this community, this digital humanities community, can make to our Indigenous communities' aspirations. So thank you so much. E kore e ngā mihi ki o kōroa, and you will see coming through the comments, many thanks for your contributions, and I never know how to conclude a digital session, so I will just stop talking and pass the rako to Paul, who is beautiful face has turned up again. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora koutou. I just want to back up what Sacha has said and just thank you all very much for a panel that, despite the technological glitches, one of our followers on Twitter is called easily the best and most relevant kōrero I've heard all year. You started our conference with a challenge to act and to think and to act ethically, and we are very grateful for the time you've taken, the thought that you've put in, the way you've opened our eyes and given us a challenge for the future. And while our panel numbers were reduced by one, I personally think that Sacha's pepe was a wonderful addition to the conversation. I think the fact that Sacha was prepared to chair this panel so soon after her daughter was born shows both how important she thinks these issues are and how much she esteems you, our panelists. And if I can throw in just a little bit of business, a reminder that at 4 o'clock, DHA2021 splits into 3 streams for a range of extremely interesting papers. To access those, you'll need to leave this webinar and log back into the stream that interests you. Panel details and the Zoom addresses are available on the conference program, and if you're not sure where to find that, just search DHA2021. Thank you all. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.